So we're a few hundred years before Jesus here, right? And, when you go to a book like Samuel, most of us in here, we're New Testament Christians, right? So most of our lives, at least growing up with me, I spent very little time in the Old Testament, almost non-existent. Matter of fact, my study for the Old Testament was mostly when I was a little kid hearing Vacation Bible School stories. That was about the extent of my Old Testament schooling, Some churches don't even really want preachers or people to teach really out of the Old Testament. They'd rather we stay in the New Testament. I never really understood the Bible till I understood the Old Testament. I never understood God till I understood it. Most of my life as a Christian, I did not understand God. I mean, that's a terrible thing to say. I mean, I sat in churches and sat in studies for classes my whole life. I grew up sitting in a pew. Wasn't always Church of Christ pew, but I grew up sitting in a pew. And, I'll be honest, I didn't know much about God. I knew what people wanted me to think. I knew most of the sermons I heard as a child were feel-good sermons. They were feel-good sermons. They were raise money sermons, and they were. That's mostly what I heard, and that's what I remember. I think when you exclude the Old Testament from your study, you limit your knowledge about God. God's God, and let's face it, God's a lot more blatant and out front and open in the Old Testament than he is in the New Testament. That's just a fact, if you want to see God in the raw, you're going to look at the Old Testament, because that's where you're going to see God in the raw. That's where you see God for what God is. And there's problems when you start looking at the Old Testament. I agree with you, and people like to throw it in our face, mean God, right? Terrible God, kills people, wipes out entire nations, kills children, right? Tells people to kill children, tells people to kill everything, That's the reality of the Old Testament. And when I remember when I first went to OU, I got that thrown in my face really hard. How can you believe in a God who kills nations? How can you believe in a God who signs off on genocide? Those were questions I got asked a lot, So when you open up the Old Testament, it should change your view about the whole thing. And, why is Samuel so important? Samuel, of course, you got to kind of take 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Samuel. They're kind of a go-together. You can't really take one of them without the other. They kind of all fit that time frame. But, Samuel, the reason I like Samuel compared to 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st, 2nd Chronicles, which it's always good to cross-reference them when you're studying Samuel. But the reason I like Samuel is because of the story. To me, 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles have a whole lot of information, but not a lot of story. There are a lot of information there, but it's not a story. 1st and 2nd Samuel is a story. It's an ancient story. It's old, and that's good. So when we start talking about Samuel, what's so pivotal about this book? What makes this time in the history of Israel be so important, do you think? Have our first what here? First king, right? There were no kings in Israel, right? No kings. God didn't want kings, right? That was man's doing, not God. God didn't want him to have a king. God never wanted him to have a king. It's our first king, Saul, right? Saul was our first king from the smallest tribe of Benjamin. Saul was the first king, right? And the kingly is lineage, right? And should be lineage. king, the king, the king. Goes down the family, right? Just like in England, right? It's, you're a king, then your son's a king, and her daughter or whatever, but it goes on that lineage, right? Goes on that lineage. But God skipped out of that, right? I mean, Saul wasn't obedient, and God punished Saul. God punished Saul's family. I mean, see, that's something you and we don't really understand that like they understood that. Because to you and me, I guess lineage is important to us. I mean, but it's not a make or break deal, I don't think, to any of us, I mean, I think, it's important, but it's not a make or break thing, right? Because as Christians, our lineage is the church, right? I mean, essentially, blood's thicker than water, right? Our lineage is the body, right? I mean, that's and I think but for a Jew, there was a couple of things going on. One is most of them didn't believe in eternity. They believed that your eternity was your lineage. They believed it was your offspring. That was how you lived. You lived in the seed of your offspring. And you lived in that seed. And if you look at the Old Testament, even Hebrews, what does Hebrews said? They paid him a tenth, right? Levi paid a tenth because they were in their father Abraham, right? In other words, that seed existed, and they paid a tenth through that lineage, right? The lineage. So lineage becomes everything. Everything. It's all you can. So that's the reason it was so important they had male children. I mean, they didn't even care about female children, really. They wanted male children, right? I mean, that was what they wanted. They wanted to have boys. They wanted to have that offspring because that was the lineage. And if you didn't have male offspring, you didn't have lineage. And so that was important, crucially important to them. And, so that's one reason that Samuel's important. It's our shift from judges to kings, right? We had judges, and then we hit Samuel, and Samuel becomes kind of this judge, priest, ruler, and then Samuel brings us Saul, and we have a king that God's not that happy with, right? So then, since Saul isn't going to work out in that lineage, God wants to pull it away from his lineage. Doesn't mean that Jonathan's a bad guy. Matter of fact, I think Jonathan was pretty upright. It means that God wasn't going to allow him to be king. Plain and simple. Wasn't going to happen. So God goes and finds David, right? And so in this story, because that's what this is, and the reason I like for you to look at it that way is because if you just look at Samuel to get the facts, then you miss Samuel. Because people who tell stories don't tell you a story to give you the facts. People tell stories to give you information, not just the facts. He wanted to give you the facts. We could write that down. We could say Saul was king, and then God turned from Saul, and now David's king, and David had an issue. But that's not what this is about. This is a story. And in the story that the writer of Samuel is telling us, he wants us to come away with a picture. Isn't that what stories are about? Isn't that why we tell people stories? Because we want them to come away with a picture, a visual image of whatever that storyteller wants us to see in the story. So when you look at Samuel, if you're just looking at it to get the facts, you miss the story. You want to read Samuel to get the story. You want to know what that writer is wanting to tell us about these characters and about God's relationship with mankind. And in doing that, we look at this ancient text way before Jesus ever came. Way before people maybe were even really thinking about Jesus coming. We look at this ancient text and we come away with these pictures in our mind. Pictures of these characters that this writer has put upon our page. Right? And so when we do that, we ask ourselves, what are we supposed to learn from them? So we got these three big guys, right? We have Saul, we have David, and we have Jonathan, right? Those are our three big players here. King Saul will be King David, and Saul's son, who should be king, Jonathan, right? You got three players. And those guys all have character traits and flaws. And I think what's interesting when you get to this point in Samuel is you got a pretty good picture of Saul. You know, Saul becomes pretty obvious who he is. He's a little deranged, right, at this particular point in the story. He has an evil spirit from the Lord that troubles him. He seems to be a little bit confused about things. But he also has a lot of issues. One thing is he feels isolated, I think, here. Doesn't feel like there's a lot of people that he can trust in his life. Jonathan's kind of went to David's side. He kind of knows that. He doesn't really trust the people that are close to him because David's gained so much favor. He's paranoid. I think we can see that in the story. Saul's become very paranoid. He wants his son to ascend to the throne, but his son seems a bit unwilling. And it seems like the relationship between Jonathan and Saul is pretty strained at this particular point, and it's going to become more strained as we go through the story. So that's one thing that Samuel brings us that's really important. But what's the other thing that Samuel brings us? It brings us David, doesn't it? And what do you think about when you think about David? Do you think, and I think there's two clues so far. Now, whether or not I hit them hard enough, I don't know. But to me, there's two clues so far in this story that kind of make you wonder a little bit, think a little bit about David. So right off with David, we know David's a man after God's own heart. I mean, that's what the scripture says, right? I mean, David's a man after God's own heart. I've chosen him, right? He's the youngest. I've chosen him. I've sent Samuel to anoint him. He's going to be king. He knows he's going to be king because Samuel anointed him with oil. He knows that's coming, right? So that's one thing we see right off. But I think there's two clues so far in the story that if you're really going to write this, really kind of think about David, I think there's two clues so far that you can't miss about David. The first one is in the battle with Goliath. We have, and when we studied that story, we had a very VBS mindset because I think that's what we see when we think about David and Goliath. We think about David going to fight the mighty giant. David defeats him and God gives him the victory, and that's the VBS story, right? But I think, and we went through it, I hope we looked at that a little deeper than the VBS story. And to me, a big clue about David is his insistence early in that story about what's in it for me. I think that's something we really miss in that story. We've got such a high view of David, and we should have. He's a man after God's own heart. He's gonna kill Goliath. We got a high view of David. But then 3 times in there, he basically says, what's he going to give the guy who does this? I think that's a clue. He put that in there for a reason, right? And then I think the other clue is when Saul says, bring me 100 foreskins of the Philistines, and I'm going to give you my daughter. And he brings 200. Now, on one hand, we could say, well, that's great. David's this mighty warrior, and he just did way more than Saul wanted him to do. I mean, that's what you see on the surface, right? But on the other hand, David knows that Saul has it out for him. David knows that Saul is threatened by his success. David knows that Saul's not in a good place. And Saul and David throws it in his face. You see? David should have threw 100 of them on the ground outside of the tent and said, here's 100. I barely made it. You see what I'm saying? But David didn't do that. David came in with 200, threw him 200. Look at what I did. Look at what I can do. Now, you can look at it two ways. You can look at it to say, well, David just did way more, and Saul should be really happy that David could go kill 200 Philistines. But Saul never sent David to kill 100 Philistines. Saul sent David to be killed. Right? The mission was not to bring back 100 foreskins of the Philistines. The mission was not to come back. And when David did come back, instead of coming back in humility and coming back with 100, David came back with 200. I think there's a story there. So, it is, but on the other hand, maybe somebody that's trying to kill you might not be the best thing to throw it in their face at the same time too. You know what I'm saying? I mean, see, there's two ways to play that out. I mean, the Rex would be like, look what I did, booyah, you know, here you go, right? But the smart Rex would be like, I don't think I want to do that because Saul's king and he probably wants to kill me anyway, and I probably need to kind of play this low, you know. I'm just saying.
How would you not be puffed up? How would you not think you're the man? You are a young boy, and you stepped up and did what the whole army wouldn't even try. How would you not be conceited?
I'm saying you can be conceited. I understand the point. But you just told me that David was conceited.
Well, how would you not be?
But you said David was a man after God's own heart. Now you're telling me David's conceited.
No, we know that he has the confidence, and conceit probably comes along. You can be both.
Just saying, there's a story, right? Look at it how you want. It's there for a reason. There's a story, you see. So you got David now, and David is entering a really unique phase in his life at this particular point. So now you kind of got that, but now what about Jonathan? Right? I mean, you know, Jonathan could kill David. I mean, it looks like it would be to Jonathan's advantage if Saul did kill David. I mean, Jonathan could be king, you know. And Jonathan's obviously, you know, one of the very first glimpses we got of Jonathan was this mighty warrior. He went into the camp with the Philistines with his armor bearer and made this victory. So Jonathan's a capable warrior. I mean, obviously from the text, Jonathan's a more than capable warrior. And people love him. I mean, don't we get that from the text? People loved him. You know, they covered up for him. They wanted to cover it up for him. When he disobeyed what Saul said to do, the people wanted to cover it up because they loved him. And so Jonathan has the favor of the people. Jonathan's a capable warrior. Jonathan's next in line to be king. But now Jonathan's making this covenant to save David's life. So like Billy said, you know, Jonathan might know God's will. He might know that David has been anointed to be king, and maybe he just wants to be a godly guy and not stand in God's way. Maybe he thinks there's no point in standing in God's way because he knows that God has appointed David to be king, and that, you know, it'd be wrong for him to stand in the way of that. That's a possibility. But the text doesn't give us that. We don't know that he knows, but that could be, right? Maybe he's just so impressed with David that he thinks David would be a good next king. Maybe he doesn't want to be king. Maybe he doesn't want to do that. Maybe that's not his thing. Maybe he doesn't see himself being king. But whatever way, David now is going to covenant in here with Jonathan. And this is a really important covenant in the scripture, in Samuel for sure. It's a really important covenant because it's actually going to carry all the way through into 2 Samuel. It's going to carry all the way through into David's kingship. So, you know, I think when you get to this point, we got an ancient text. We got these three big players. Maybe we're starting to get a picture in our head of these guys, who they are, what they are, and maybe we can build on that. We know the story. We know the end, right? We know the end of the story. We know how this is going to play out. So David's a man after God's own heart. Bible says it, right? Saul was picked by God and then deserted by God because Saul didn't do what Saul should do. Jonathan is the player in the middle of these two individuals. So, Jonathan here is going to covenant with David. That's what we were talking about last time. Jonathan's going to covenant with David. But there's more here, right? Because as we continue through this, what is the end game? What's the end game of this? Why is David so important in biblical history? Why is David so important? There you go. We're not there yet, but it's coming, right? David is going to be the kingly line all the way still is. David is still the kingly line. David is still the kingly line today, right now, right? David is still that lineage because Jesus is our king, and Jesus sits on the throne of David. David is the lineage, the Davidic lineage still exists through Christ. That's 2 Samuel 7. We're not there yet, but it still exists. Jesus sits on that throne. So this is important for us because David has to be king. This is all going to tie into David. It's all going to tie into David. It's all going to tie into the tribe, right? It's all going to tie into the tribe of Judah. I mean, all this is coming together. And when I was a kid, like I said, I listened to a lot of preaching. I listened to a lot of classes, but nobody ever taught me this stuff. I didn't have a clue how this fit together. Didn't have a clue. And if you can understand this, and we can get through this, and you can understand this at the end, when you read Peter's sermon in Acts 2, it's going to be a whole lot different sermon to you than it is right now, because it all comes back to this. So Peter's whole argument comes back to this. And so, you talk about faith, you talk about teaching people about Christ, you talk about the Bible being real. This is real. This is what makes it real. I mean, if it wasn't for this stuff, then somehow Jesus just popped on the scene in Bethlehem and became our Savior, and we don't really know why any of that makes sense or why that happened or what that has to do with us at all. It just happened, and that's not how this works. It's not how this works. People who don't believe in God, people who don't believe in the Bible, don't study this. Because that's where it comes from. So I think it's important. I hope you find it important. I'm sorry to digress, but I want you to see that this is more than just looking at history on a page. This is looking at where Jesus comes from. And if we can understand that, the Bible makes a lot more sense. It really does. I mean, Peter tells us, right? Jesus came according to the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. This is the predetermined plan. This is where it all starts, back here. Well, actually, it starts way before this, but this is so crucial in tying it all together. And this covenant, I'm not going to read all this. This covenant becomes so important, and this is, send the arrows past, you need to flee. If they're not, then don't. Y'all can read that for yourself, because I want to get down to this. Covenant. The new moon, seat being empty. When Jonathan does this, because he's testing Saul out, and I think this is really important. He's testing Saul out. Are you mad at David or not? You can go back and read all that for yourself. Are you mad at David or not? And of course, Jonathan, he knows, right? Saul knows. Saul knows you're on David's side. And so Saul gets mad at Jonathan, right? You're supposed to be king. You're the next in line to the throne. You are my heir. You are supposed to be the king. And yet Jonathan does not want that. Jonathan's not stepping up to that at all. And so Saul's anger burns against him, and he said, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman. Do I not know that?" Isn't it interesting how he blames it on the mother here, right? It's not my fault, it's your mother's fault, right? And he says, I just had a really weird thought in my head, has to do with Smoking the Bandit. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, okay, so if you know Smoking the Bandit, you know the reference. But he says, for as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send to bring him to me, for he must die, right? Jonathan answered, and he said, why should he be put to death? What has he done? It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant, because he's in the way of you being a king. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if there's anything wrong. He's in the way of you being king, right? And Saul hurled a spear at him to strike him down, so Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. So Saul's going to kill Jonathan, right? Saul's striking out against Jonathan, this insolent son of this insolent mother. So anyway, he's going to do this because he wants him to be king, and he wants him to want it. You can't make somebody want this, right? Jonathan arose in a fierce anger, did not eat food on the second day of the new moon, was grieved over David because his father had dishonored him. I want to bring something to point here, and that's this new moon thing. That's kind of we talked about the idols in Michelle's bed, right? Astrology is not a godly thing. Just kicking that out there for you, right? Matter of fact, God says we should put that away from us, right? Astrologists, magicians, sorcerers, astrologists. Why is God against astrology? I know this is way off topic. I think it's interesting because we're doing this feast on a moon, right? Why? Why are we doing this feast on a new moon? Because we're not doing what God wants us to do. So, why is God against astrologists? Why is God against astrology? Wasn't there a star that showed where Jesus was? Isn't that astrology? I don't know. Why is God against that? Why does God not? Nobody's going to. It's believing in something that's not God, right? It's no different than having an idol, right? I mean, you're worshiping something, believing in something that doesn't change anything, right? I just think it's interesting here. I think there's a lot, like I said, it's a story. When you read it, you've got to pick out these things that this story writer wants you to see, And I think we don't do that with this stuff. We look at it and we read it and we get the facts and we miss the story, and we just can't miss the story. So, there's bad things. We saw an idol in Michelle's tent, right? Put it in place of David, right? Now we're worried about a moon, right? Why are we worried about a moon, right? So he says he was grieved over David because his father dishonored him. And it came in the morning, Jonathan went out in the field. And this is what you got to get to. I mean, if you're going to underline something in your Bible right here, this is what you got to get to, because this is where he's going to tell David this. But more importantly, if I can get to it, more importantly, and it's coming right after this slide. There we go. It says, so he got to that. David rose, and Jonathan said, "Go in safety." Look at this verse. This is important. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety as much as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Then he rose and departed while Jonathan went into the city. It's a really interesting passage because it's covenant. And I've spoke a lot about covenant. And I always said covenant had to have a what? Sign. Covenant's got to have a sign. Covenants in the Bible have signs. There's always signs of covenant. right? And so when he did this with the arrows, then he reiterated it. He says, now we have a contract. Now we have a covenant because we have a sign of covenant. Now we have a covenant. You can't break it. It's between you and the Lord. You can't break it. You and I, when we become Christians, we're baptized, and that's a what? It's a covenant, right? You get married to somebody, you put a ring on their finger, that's a what? Covenant. You go to the lawyer and you make a contract and you sign the bottom of it. That's a what? Covenant, right? Signs a covenant. When God covenanted with Abraham, you cut the stuff in two, walk between the halves, right? Covenant, covenant, covenant. You got to have it. When God covenants with Israel, when he brings them out of the promised land, Exodus 30, what's he do? He kills the bulls and he sprinkles the blood on the people. Sign of covenant, sign of covenant. So once again, we get to this point. He does the arrows. We do this thing, this physical thing, and Jonathan says, now we have a covenant, and you can't break it. It's from now on. You've signed this covenant. You've contracted. You've made a covenant vow. Between the Lord and me. Right? So you've made a covenant. When you covenant with something between the Lord, when you as a Christian, when you marry somebody, you covenant with them. That's a covenant relationship. You've covenanted them between the Lord. You've made a covenant. Right? Why does Jesus say not to commit adultery? Why does he say that if you're in a covenant? Because you break the covenant, right? You've made a covenant. You break it. You broke covenant. As Christians, even though we're baptized into Christ, we can break covenant, right? We can fall from grace. We can break covenant. Because any covenant can be broken. Because a covenant depends on two parties, right? And either party can break covenant. And you can't stop that. It's not in your power. You can only control you. But David is going to honor this covenant eventually. Because David is a man after God's own heart. And God honors what? Absolutely. God honors covenant, doesn't he? You see? So sometimes when you look at David and say, well, David's a man after God's own heart, but David sinned. David had this big sin with Bathsheba. David numbered Israel. All these things we're going to talk about in 2 Samuel. David did all these things wrong. You just say David's a man after God's own heart. How is David a man after God's own heart? He was patient. He looked to God.
He asked for forgiveness from God.
Yep.
I mean, he done a lot of things right. Didn't mean he was blameless.
Right. But one way that David was like God is this story. David honored covenant. He didn't have to. Matter of fact, there was no reason he had to do it, but he's going to do it because he's going to honor this agreement, this covenant with God. Whew. Any comments?
So what were you saying about wasn't that Hebrew?
Well, he didn't eat because he was upset, but
That was a Hebrew
he said,
day of the month when they were supposed to eat, right?
yeah, he said Saul's going to do this on the new moon. He's going to have this dinner on the new moon. Going to have.
So he was being defiant of their custom.
Yeah, well, there are things to do with the moon in the Old Testament, but I still think it goes back, this is something that obviously had come in. God, like I said, God doesn't really support that idea biblically of astrology, magicians, all that kind of goes together in the Bible. Sayers, astrologists, magicians.
Didn't it signify a new month? It signified Shabbat? It signified...
Well, the moons don't necessarily go in phase with months. I mean, there are certain dates, but moons don't necessarily go in phase with dates. So, there are certain dates in the Hebrew that dates are important. There's a certain 14th of Nisan is Passover. I mean, there's dates that are important. Day of Atonement. There's days that are important. But when you start talking about moons and phases and solstices, you start talking about pagans. Because pagans watched astrology. Who came to Jesus' birth? Jews or pagans? Pagans, right? Because they were watching the star, because that's what they did, right? You see, we shouldn't put our faith in anything other than God, right? In anything other than God. You know? So when we do that, we have to put them other things to the side that other people put their faith in. Everybody's got a religion, people. They might not have a God, but everybody's got a religion. Just telling you. Right? But we have a God. We have one God. And that God demands us to reverence and honor and trust in Him alone. Isn't that what it says in Deuteronomy? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Right? Not gods. Right? The Lord your God is one God. That doesn't mean He doesn't have the Father, the Son. That doesn't mean we don't have Spirit, God, and Son. It's not what that means. It means one God. It's like when we talk about the qualification of elders. The husband of one wife. Very bad. One woman man. One woman man. There's a big difference in that. There's a huge difference in that. I know a whole lot of people are the husband of one wife that are not one woman man. You agree with me? Big difference, isn't there? Who do you want running the church? Husband of one wife or a one-woman man? I want a one-woman man. I want somebody that's dedicated, that honors covenant, right? That has eyes for one only. Don't you? I do. You see how big a difference that is? I'm totally out of time, and I've totally gone 100 directions today, but thanks for being here.